Hello, welcome to my channel. I hope you're doing very well. Don't worry, this isn't going to be me talking at the camera the whole time. We are going to get onto the Akai Force very shortly. I've had quite a few comments or questions under my videos, particularly the tutorials, asking for videos about how I go about making a track, what is my process and so forth. That's quite a difficult video to make because the process is different every time. So one, this is how I do it video is kind of difficult. So what I thought I would do is make 3 videos that outline 3 processes or kind of principles that I use every time to get going on a track and to make my tracks that kind of describe the process in full. So this is the first one, and we're going to be looking at the subjects of space and groove. Now, when I say space, I don't mean space in the reverb sense, like the shape of a room or whatever. I'm talking about the sonic space, or in this case, the rhythmic space that every instrument or every part in a piece of music inhabits. So that's what I mean by space. And then groove, which I think is enormously important, and the relationship between those two things. And I think if you ask a lot of people what is groove, they will quite often say, oh, that's the drums and the bass. And that's like a half right answer. In a lot of music, that's where the groove comes from, but it isn't what the groove is. And as I think the perfect example of groove would be the song Sex Machine by James Brown. I can't play you any of it because I'll get a copyright strike. But it's got one of the most, kind of urgent moving grooves you could ever hear. But when you listen to that song and listen to the parts in isolation, the groove doesn't really come from the drums and the bass. It comes from the drums and the snare and also James Brown's voice as well. And if you listen to those 4 parts, the drums are quite straight, quite simple, not doing anything particularly interesting. The bass is very staccato. It comes in and out for little periods of time. The guitar, the rhythm guitar, that chank, chank noise is very simple. There's nothing remarkable about any of those parts in isolation, but it's the way they fit together that makes the groove. It makes us want to move. And in my opinion, that is the most important thing when making any kind of up-tempo or upbeat music that you want to be thinking about. And it's looking for opportunities to find space and find groove, because Sex Machine by James Brown, there's so much space in that song. There's very little stuff clashing with each other. It all slots together so nicely. That's where the groove comes from. So what we're going to do is look at some options when you're building a track where you can think about space. So to build lots of space into your arrangements, which lets the rhythmic parts come together to create the groove, which is what will make the music that much more interesting. To be honest, whenever I make a track, it's that principle that guides me all the way through. It pulls me from the start to end. Every decision I make is based on, is this adding to the groove, and am I leaving enough space for it to breathe? Anyway, that's enough of me waffling on. Let's get onto the Force and look at some of these ideas in practice. Okay, so we have 5 tracks set up here. The first is just one of the factory tech house kits. The second is a bass patch in the tube synth. The third is a pad sound on hype. The fourth is a pluck, a little popcorn pluck kind of sound. And the fifth is a vocal sample. So to demonstrate what I was talking about with space and groove, I've created a 4-bar loop here that has neither of those things. It's got no space, no groove. I've just layered patches or parts on top of each other with no thought to those things, and this is what it sounds like. Doesn't sound terrible. Bring the vocal in. Doesn't sound terrible. It's not awful. But there's nothing interesting going on. There's no groove. There's no space. If you listen to it again, everything is mushed together. Everything's playing at the same time. So it's just boring and not interesting and generic and rubbish, basically, even though it sounds okay. So what we're going to do is take those 5 elements and attempt to make something which demonstrates space and groove. Now, we have to start somewhere, obviously. We always need a starting point. And I think every part that you lay down in an arrangement affects the next one. They kind of follow on from each other. And because of that, if you start from a boring place, if you always go into the sequencer and just lay down a 4 on the floor kick drum pattern, that is going to pull you in a similar direction every time. So what I try and do is make my first thing that I come up with something which is rhythmically or melodically interesting as a starting point, and then build everything else around that. So if you start from interesting, it's easier to remain interesting. And also if it's rhythmically interesting, if it's got some rhythmic dynamism to it, you can then plug your other parts into gaps within that rhythm, which is where your groove comes from. So in this instance, what I'm going to do is take that vocal sample, chop it up, and see if I can make a nice rhythmic and melodic part that does something interesting, which we will then kind of build the rest of the parts around. So I'm going to do that now. I'll probably fast forward this because figuring out chops and slicing a sample is not very interesting, but we'll come back when I've found the chops and found the part, and we'll listen to that. Okay, so I've chopped that vocal sample up into some slices, and I've created a little pattern, a little rhythmic pattern here, which is going to sound odd when you listen to it on its own. So the reason I've made it like this is it has the beginnings of something that's rhythmically interesting, but there's lots of gaps in it. It's not filled up the whole space of this 4-bar loop. So if you listen to it again, you can hear that in between the vocal little chops, there's room to put some other stuff to fit inside those gaps. So immediately, just with that beat there, that downbeat, there's something we can do. So the next decision to make is, what are we going to work on next? I think it would probably be quite good to stick a kick drum in there somewhere and figure out what kick pattern is going to work quite nicely with those kind of vocal chops, those sort of emphasis points. So we'll do that. I'll have a play with that. See if I can figure out a nice kick pattern, and then we'll come back and listen to how that works together. Okay, got a little kick drum pattern in here. Now I've resisted the urge just to go 4 on the floor, just to see if we can make something that's a little bit more interesting. It might be that we scrap this when we've got some other parts in and we do revert back to a 4 on the floor. But you'll see I've got a slightly syncopated kick drum pattern, which I think works quite nicely with the vocal chop. Turn the metronome off. So as you can hear, they're slightly off kilter, which is starting to give us a slightly kind of interesting groove here. So I think the next thing to do is to add a bass line into this, which will tie the low end together, kick and the bass together, which will become the foundation of the groove with that vocal chop. And then we can start adding some melodic elements with the pluck sound and the pad to try and make or to tie the sort of the middle part of the sonic space together. So we've got something rhythmically interesting, melodically interesting happening as well. So I'll have a little play around with the bass line now, see if we can come up with something that works. Okay, got a little bass pattern. It's very, very simple. But I think it fits quite nicely with the kick drum and the vocal chop. So let's have a listen to that. Turn the vocals down a bit. So if you just listen to the kick and the bass in isolation, we've got them slightly syncopated there. There's a couple of, at certain parts, the bass and the kick are hitting at the same time, and other parts, especially at the end here, they're slightly apart, and I think that brings a nice bit of movement and the beginnings of a groove, especially when we bring the vocal chops back in, which are again slightly syncopated from these two. So we've got the beginnings of something interesting now. One of the things to bear in mind is when you are trying to do something like this, which is rhythmically interesting, has got a bit of a groove, you can't go too far. You need some elements which are doing kind of counterpoints to each other, but you also need some things to stitch it all together and to make it sound like a whole. And listening to that now, I think we need quite a straight hi-hat line over the top, or 16th notes with maybe some 30-second note kind of flourishes or ratchets built into it, which will kind of, where we've got this stuff at the bottom end rhythmically, which is kind of fluid and moving around a bit, that straight hi-hat lane through the middle will tie it together and give the syncopated rhythm some context. So let's do that now. I'm going to add the hi-hat in before we start messing around with the melodic stuff. Okay, I've done that. I've added the hi-hat, just as I said, 16th notes with some little 30-second note ratchets. I've also put a very straight clap on as well to do the same thing, to tie the middle part of this groove together and let the syncopated bass and kick drum kind of work underneath it. And this is what it sounds like. So to add some more rhythmic interest to that, I think on this vocal chop, I'm going to add a delay so that there's some kind of repeats after each one and see what that sounds like. So we'll do that in real time, see how it goes. So mixer, effects, let's stick a delay in here. Let's go for 8. Yeah. So we've got something quite interesting going on here now. So what we want to do, I think, next step is to add some of the pluck sound in to give some melodic interest to this part and see how that goes. So I'll dive off screen and just come up with something and then come back when I've added it, same as I did before. Okay, I thought I'd record this on camera just to show you how I'm going to do it. Quite often when we use the arpeggiator, the temptation is just to hold it down and let it run. But actually you can get some really nice effects by sort of holding it momentarily and letting it do that kind of thing. And that's what I'm going to do for this ARP part now. So I'm just going to create a clip, make it 4 bars, and then launch this. Where are we, on the right one? And record it. So you can see by coming in and out with the pads instead of just holding it down, that again gives us something which is more rhythmically interesting than just holding it down and having that repeating pattern go all of the way through. So again, with that syncopated arpeggiated rhythm, with the kind of off-kilter vocal chops and everything else, that's starting to sound much more interesting than our first pattern. So let's just listen to that. So again, everything is very simple. Thinking back to the James Brown, not that I'm likening myself to James Brown, to the James Brown Sex Machine example, all of those parts are really simple. There's nothing remarkable going on, but because we've carefully chosen where the individual bits are rhythmically, they're starting to lock together and we're getting quite an interesting groove. Now, in the same way as we syncopated our kick drum and bass and put the snare and the hi-hat on a straight line, we've got quite interesting stuff going on with the pluck and the vocal chops. So when we put our pad in, I think we can do the same thing as we did with the hi-hats and put something quite solid with the pad in the middle, and see how that sounds, because I think we want another element which is running sort of in a linear fashion through it. So let's just try that live. There's our pad. Oh, turn the arp off. That sounds perfectly fine to me. It's basically the same as what we had in the first clip, the first scene, the boring scene. So let's just record that in. Pad, launch. Nope, wrong button. What am I doing? No, don't like that. Let's delete that and just... Sorry, I'm having brain fade. And let's copy that pad down and just use the same ones we used before. I think we might want to add a little bit of release to that pad. So let's go to our filter and amp and just dial that up a little bit. So let's switch between the two and see how they sound. Quite flat. That sounds much more interesting to me. One of the interesting kind of byproducts of this is if we start the first one again, because we didn't plan what we were doing and we just laid everything on top of each other. When everything's in, it sounds all right, but when we mute stuff out, it sounds quite empty. Again, it's all right, but with this one here, we've still got something quite interesting going on when we mute things in and out, and that's because we built the groove of this piece by piece, building on it each time. So when we take an element out, it still works, it still hangs together on its own, and that makes performance variations and just live performing a lot easier. I'd be quite interested to see what we've just built sounds like with the vocal sitting over the top of it as well, the full vocal. Sounds quite nice. So the thing I'm trying to kind of illustrate is the way that there's much more space in this arrangement than there is in the first one. There's lots of gaps, so that lets the groove of the kick drum and the snare and the vocal chops come through a lot more clearly. But as we develop this track, if we were to turn this into a full track and keep adding more and more elements to it, there's loads of space left for us to put lead lines in, to put other samples, to develop the drums further. If I was making this into a track, I would probably put like an organic or an acoustic drums sample in there, probably as a top loop, something like that. So whereas in this one, there's no room to add anything in. We can only really take stuff out. But in here, this second loop, there's much more rhythmic space, so we can drop that the vocal sample in if we want. It's much more rhythmically interesting to me, I think, anyway. So the object of this was to kind of illustrate my approach to starting a track. So my tips are start from something, whether it's a sample, whether it's a pattern or an art, whatever it is that's rhythmically interesting, and build the rest of your track around that, as opposed to starting in the same way with a 4 on the floor kick drum pattern or something like that. And that way, if you start with interest, you will build interest, as opposed to doing things the same way every time and ending up with something which is really full and really congested and there's no room to add anything. Anyway, I think we'll leave it there because this video is getting on for being probably too long. So in the next one video in this series, part 2, we're going to look at call and response and building tension, which are two different things. Tension and release, I should say, which are two different things, but they sort of do the same thing. So we're going to look at that and how you can apply tension and release and call and response into your tracks to make them more interesting. I hope that was useful. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye for now.